Welcome to this training video on installing the change parts on your Dixie Seamer. These steps are for all Dixie double seamer models. For the first step, we'll be installing the chuck. You'll need your chuck wrench, which fits all sizes, and your 5/8 wrench. First, you'll hand tighten as much as possible. Then, insert the chuck wrench into the pre-drilled holes in the chuck, and hold the chuck shaft in place on top with your 5/8 wrench. Once the chuck hits the shoulder, shown here, it will stop and be fully in place. Next, we'll install the base plate. For this, you'll need your 5/8 wrench, a 7/16 wrench, a 1/2-inch wrench, a set of end nippers, a long shaft flathead screwdriver, and one can and one lid. Once the shaft of the base plate has been greased and oiled with food-grade lubricants, we seat the base plate into the hole. Then, with the 7/16 wrench, loosen the nuts on the front to remove the hatch. Next, we remove the compressed air supply so that we can manually manipulate the lift. Here you can see that you can manipulate the lift with the screwdriver as your lever. At this point, you can place your can onto the base plate. We'll need to lock that in place so it does not turn. Once your shaft is adjusted to the proper height, use your 5/8 wrench to hold the shaft in place and your 1/2-inch wrench on the locking nut. Tighten it down to hold it in place. Now that we're properly adjusted, we can lower the lift and remove the can. Next, we're going to install our levers that hold the seam rolls. For this sequence, you'll need your flathead screwdriver and a 1/2-inch wrench. Install the first operation seam roll into one of your seam roll levers. Secure with the provided bolt and tighten using your flathead screwdriver. Once tight, make sure your seam roll is spinning freely. Next, turn on the machine and advance it 4.5 rotations. Press the clutch actuator 4 times. Then turn off the machine and release it. Take your chuck wrench and turn the final 1/2 rotation. Next, we'll install the seam roll lever. Make sure that the small oil hole near the seam roll is facing up. Line up the splines on the shaft with the spline recesses on the seam roll lever so that you can get as close to the chuck as possible without making contact. Slide it up, then manipulate it so that you can get it into the chuck groove so the seam roll goes smoothly in and out without rubbing on the chuck. Next, you need to get your machine back to neutral. To do this, you need to put the machine through 10 rotations. When in neutral, your cams, one in the front and one in the back, will be at the furthest point in, and your seam rolls will be at the furthest point out. Now, again, we'll advance the machine 4.5 rotations. We press the actuator 4 times, turn the machine off, release the clutch, and use the chuck wrench to advance the chuck that final 1/2 rotation. Then loosen the locking nut with the 3/16 wrench. Using the Allen wrench, manipulate the adjusting screw, bringing the seam roll close to the chuck. Then place your first operation gauge wire between the chuck and the profile of the seam roll and continue to adjust with your Allen wrench until the gauge wire fits snugly in between them. Then tighten the locking nut to secure the seam roll lever in place. We now have to remove the gauge wire and get the machine back to neutral, so turn the machine back on. Since we've already turned the chuck 4.5 times, we'll press the actuator 5 more times to get the machine to 10 rotations and back to neutral. Turn the machine off and then back on again to reset the count. Then we place a can with a lid on the base plate and turn the machine on to test the location of our first seam roll. Measure the seam height and seam width to check specifications relative to manufacturer recommendations. You can tighten or loosen the seam roll adjustment screw to increase or decrease seam height and width. If your body hook is too short and you want to increase it, simply remove the base plate, loosen the locking screw, and use your end nippers to increase or decrease the length of the adjusting screw. Lock it back into place with your screwdriver and reinstall the base plate. By raising the base plate, you have created more pressure. Increasing base plate pressure will decrease seam height and increase the seam width. You can run another can to test and see if the first operation seam height and width are correct. Once you have correct first operation seam height and width, You're ready to install your second operation seam roller. For our second operation, the seam roll will be closest to the chuck at the 9th rotation. Therefore, we press the actuator 9 times to put the machine through 9 cycles to reach the desired point. Then slide the seam roll lever onto the arm, getting as close as possible to the chuck without touching. Center the lip of the seam roll into the chuck groove and tighten it down to hold it in place. Then advance the machine once more to get the machine back to neutral. Turn the machine off and turn it back on again to reset the count. Now take your 11/16 wrench and your 3/16 Allen wrench and loosen the locking nut, backing up and giving yourself room to adjust. Then move it back in closer to the chuck, inserting our second operation gauge wire, the thinner of the two. Adjust the locking nut until that wire is held snugly in place. Next, put the machine back in neutral by pressing the actuator once and removing the gauge wire. Now we're ready to test again with our can. Once the can has run through the operation, check the can for your can manufacturer's recommended seam specifications. This concludes this training on installing the change parts on your Dixie Seamer. If you have further questions, please contact us at 706-549-1914 or sales@dixiecanner.com.